So the ability to write code without setting up any infrastructure on which to run it sounds pretty good, doesn't it? So no servers, no virtual machines, no containers even, not even a development environment on your machine. Sounds pretty good, doesn't it? So if you stick around today, you're going to learn exactly how to do that. Well, hello, wherever you are, whenever you are. Where am I? Melbourne, Australia. And when is it? It's November 2019. Well, as I alluded to in the introduction, today we're going to be talking about serverless compute, and in particular functions on Azure, or as are more well known as Azure Functions. So today we'll go through a bit of the theory. I've got a couple of very quick slides on that. But more importantly, we're going to delve into a practical example on how to use Azure Functions in your own applications. And the pattern I'm going to teach you today is hopefully something you can take and reuse elsewhere. So I think we're just about ready to get started. Just before we do that, one last thing by way of an introduction. If you want to get notified of more of my videos that I put up, please remember to subscribe to the channel and ding the little bell to get notified. And if you like the video, please give it a like. But I think other than that, I think we're ready to get started. So yes, we're going to be going over Azure Functions in C#, step by step. As always, no skipping, no jumping. So what you'll need for this video, you'll need an account on Azure. You'll need a web browser and internet connection. I'm assuming if you're watching this on YouTube, you already have that sorted out. And about 40 minutes of your time. So what are Azure Functions? Well, they're small, discrete pieces of code. And what I mean by discrete is they do one thing usually in response to an event. So they're not long, fully featured, sprawling applications that comprise multiple classes and all that kind of stuff. That's really not what Azure Functions are about. They are about doing one thing well in response to some kind of trigger. So they should be relatively small and relatively compact. You could almost think, if you've heard of something like microservices, they're not, you could use them in a microservices environment potentially, but they're kind of that same sort of idea. They do one thing and they do it really well. That's basically what Azure Functions are. They're serverless. I don't personally particularly like the term serverless because ultimately the code is going to sit on a server somewhere, but I suppose what they mean by that is, as a developer, as somebody writing and using Azure Functions, you don't have to worry about setting up a virtual machine, setting up containers, or anything like that. You just basically write the function in Azure, and Azure takes care of the rest of everything else, and that includes scaling it out and making sure it can deal with the demand. You don't have to worry about any of that stuff. As part of the Azure free sign up, if you're signing up for Azure, you get 1 million Azure function calls per month. So depending on what you're doing, you may or may not bust that limit. I am certainly not going to come anywhere near to that. So in effect, what I'm doing here today is free. And yes, as I said, Azure Functions react to triggers. There's a number of different triggers they can react to. The two main ones are HTTP triggers, so no surprises. You make a HTTP request to your trigger, probably providing it with some data, maybe not, and the function will then take that data or take that trigger and do something with it. Maybe call another API or do something else. The other trigger, from my perspective, is the timer trigger. That's the one we're going to be using today. So we're going to execute our function on a schedule. Could be any time, once per day, once every minute, doesn't matter, but that's what we're going to use ours for. And then you've got all these other triggers that you can use as part of Azure. So Azure has a number of service offerings. The Event Hub is one of them. You can trigger functions from that. You can trigger functions from a number of other Azure services, which I'm not going to go into today. So what are we building? So we're obviously going to be using an Azure function, and in this instance it's going to get triggered by a timer once per day, and what it's going to do is it's going to go to Stack Overflow or Stack Exchange really and query the question repository for any new questions that have arrived based on a particular search criteria within the previous day. Now, the idea behind this was actually, it was a question I was asked in a job interview about how would I use Stack Overflow as part of developing a as part of developing a developer community, or building a developer community, that's what I meant to say. So how do I use Stack Overflow to build a developer community? And my kind of answer was, well, I would write some kind of little bit of code that would go to Stack Overflow, pull down any questions that people had about our company's product within the last day, and it would then notify me, if you go back to our little schematic here, notify me via Slack, or it could be email, or it could be something else, with the number of new questions that have arrived. And then that would enable me as a developer community relations person to go to Stack Overflow, get the questions and answer them for the developers, thus being quick and responsive and all that kind of stuff. So again, you may not want to use Stack Overflow as your trigger point, or not your trigger point, as your data source, and you might not want to use Slack as your endpoint. You might want to use a messaging API or something. Nonetheless, the pattern, I think, is quite a useful one. So that's what we're going to build today. So we'll make use of the Stack Exchange API, and we'll make use of the Slack webhook in order to send messages to it. So enough talking, let's start coding. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is set up Slack. Now, if you've not used Slack before, it's a collaboration tool. Think of it just like a group chat type application. It does more stuff than that. It's a bit oversimplifying it, but it's used a lot by developer teams to collaborate with each other via chat. And you can separate those chats into channels that are, well, you define how you want to structure your channels. It could be along what products you're developing, or it could be based around your development workflow or department or something like that. So not important for this video, but you can have multiple people chatting to each other based on channels, basically it. So I'm not going to show you how to sign up for an account. I mean, that's just insulting your intelligence. Just go to slack.com, sign up, it's free. Once you've done so, you'll be presented with something like this. I already have a few channels created in my Slack instance, but I'm going to create a new channel just for this application. So all you do is click channel, we'll call it something like Azure Functions, and we'll click create. It's going to ask us to add people. We're going to skip that for now. What we then want to do is we want to then add the ability to send messages to this channel from another application. So what we do, or what we need to do, is add an application. So if you click on, get rid of that, and click the little information icon, you'll get this menu up here. Just click on add app, and the one we want is incoming webhook. So here you are. If you start typing in incoming, you'll see this one here, and this just tells you what it is. It allows you to send data to Slack in real time. Click install, and it just gives you a bit more detail about what it is, and we simply just click add to Slack. So it just asks you what channel you want to post to. So I have my existing channels here, but I want to select the new Azure Functions channel I've just created, and then we simply click add incoming webhook. Cool, and it gives you a bit more detail about how you use it. Don't worry, I'm going to take you through that. But the one thing you will want to take note of is this webhook URL. So just copy that. I think I had one from before, so let's get rid of that one and just paste it in here. So just a notepad with this webhook, because we'll reuse that later on. I think that's about it. Let's just scroll down. Yeah, you just want to save settings. You can change things like the icon that will appear when the messaging comes in and all that stuff. I'm not going to bother doing that here. That's just, you can do that yourself. Play around with it when you have the time to do so. Cool. So that's added to our channel. Hopefully clicking on, I hate when people do that. You can't actually hit back. That really annoys me. So let's just go back to slack.com. My workspace is binary thistle. And yeah, here we are. Here's our Azure Functions channel. And you can see we've got a little message. I added an integration to this channel. That's cool. So that's that set up. What we want to do now is just test that this is all working properly. So let's do that now. So in the interests of keeping this completely serverless, we're going to use an application or a website called API Tester. Tester.com. Now, usually I would recommend you use something like Postman. I have Postman installed on my desktop, but again, in this video, I'm trying to just use all web-based stuff. And this is actually it's a really good site. It allows you to basically test APIs, which is pretty awesome. So all we want to do is set this to post, because we're actually posting data to our webhook. We want to get our webhook URL, copy that and paste it in here. And then our post data. So this is just a very simple JSON string. So curly bracket, double quotes, text as our key, colon, and then our data. So anything you want, the message you want to send to Slack. So hello from API Tester. So before we click anything else, you would click on test. Before we do that, let's just move this out the way here. And here's our Azure function. If we click test, I think it's saying about cookies, let's close that down. All things being well, there we go. So we've actually got a incoming webhook, awesome, from a third-party app, in this case, API Tester. And it gives you, it's a really good website, it gives you all sorts of feedback on how it all performed and all that sort of stuff. So don't need to delve into that anymore. This was really just to test the fact that our API or our webhook is working correctly, and it is. Okay, so now what we want to do, you'll be pleased to hear, is actually create our Azure function on Azure. Now, I've just logged into my Azure portal here, and this is what it looks like today. I'm not going to take you through how to sign up for an Azure account. It's pretty straightforward. You do need to provide a credit card, just be aware. But if you're following along with this tutorial and you've signed up for the free account, then you're not going to incur any charges unless you make more than 1 million function calls per month to the function we're going to create now. That's up to you. Obviously, if you do that, I think it's unlikely you will, and you're therefore not going to incur any charges. The other thing I did want to say, as with most cloud platforms, Azure is always having new features. It's always being slightly redesigned and optimized. So just be aware that, you know, I'm making this video today, which is sometime in November 2019. If you're watching this video any time later than that, you know, in 2020 or whatever, what I'm going to take you through might look slightly different. It shouldn't look so radically different that you can't follow along, but just be aware that, you know, this is made at a point in time, and it will probably change subtly over time. So just be aware of that. Anyway, so over in our Azure portal, we want to click on Create Resource, and what we want to search for is Function App. Not, whoops. I don't know what was happening in my mind there. Function App, and we'll click Create. Okay, so subscription, pay-as-you-go, that's my pay-as-you-go subscription. What resource group? Resource groups are just groups of resources. I'm going to reuse an existing one. By all means, create a new one if you want, that's fine. The name of our app, let's call it Stack, as in Stack Overflow, and then aggregator, Stack Ag. That's all good. It's unique on Azure websites, which is cool. How do we want to publish it? Do we want to just publish code? Yes, that's what we're going to do here. You can publish a Docker container if you want. We're not going to go with that option. The runtime stack. Now, this is something I didn't mention in the introduction, and I probably should have. You can use a number of different languages with Azure Functions. Obviously, given my channel, we're going to use C# on .NET Core, but if you're a Java person or a Python person, you can, of course, select that. But again, this video is on .NET Core and C#. The region, I'm in Australia, mate, so my region is actually Australia South East, but I'm going to select Australia East because we're going to set up something called Insights, and for some reason they are not available in this region, and it starts complaining a little bit if you have a function app in one region and your Insights in another region. It still works, but it just complains. So anyway, for an easy life, we will select Australia East and move on to hosting. Storage account, so with a lot of applications, with a lot of services, you may incur or you may need to store data somewhere, so that's why you need a storage account. Again, with the free package of stuff you get with Microsoft at sign up, we shouldn't really incur any charges here. So we're just going to create a new one, that's all good. The operating system, now I actually find this a really strange option here because again, we're talking about serverless compute. Why do I care whether it's Linux or Windows? I shouldn't care about that. I don't care about that, but we'll leave it as Windows. And then finally the plan. Now again, one of the great things about Azure Functions is that you don't have to worry about setting up how you scale out virtual machines or anything like that. It just takes care of it for you, and the consumption plan is perfect for that. So we're going to leave it on the consumption plan. You can select other plans, but that requires a bit more setup, and for me sort of defeats the whole purpose of just writing code. So next we'll move on to monitoring, and this is what I was talking about, the application insight stuff. So we're going to create a new range of insights for this application, which is cool, and we're going to put it in the Australia East region. So yep, we want insights, yes. Let's leave defaults, that's all good. Move on to tags, we don't need anything like that. And then finally we click create, and it will just give you a bit of a review screen with everything we've selected. It all looks pretty good. Yep, so I think we click create. And that will go away and it will start to deploy your Azure function. It will probably take a minute or so, so you'll get notified when it's done. So I will just edit the video appropriately to jump to the point at which it gets created. But when you're doing this in your own environment or your own session, it will take a bit longer than how it will appear in this video. Okay, so we've just got a notification that our deployment succeeded. Just interestingly though, I did get a very strange message here. I just ignored that and let the deployment proceed. It did look like it succeeded, so let's go to the resource. So don't panic if you get that strange messaging. Clicking on it, it looks like it's fine. So this takes us now into the Azure function configuration page, and now we're going to start using this as a launch board to start writing our code. Okay, so we're going to start writing our code now. We'll take a look at the different environments that you could potentially use to do that, but let's step through it first of all. So the first thing you want to do is on this functions tab here, you just want to click on the plus sign. And yes, as I was saying, it gives you some options about the environment that you will use or want to use to write your code. Now, I would suggest if you're doing a lot of this stuff, you would probably want to use something like Visual Studio or VS Code to do it. In the interests of keeping this all in browser and totally serverless, we're going to use the in portal option, which is fine for doing small bits of coding. It's totally okay. But again, if you did want to do some more hands-on stuff and you were doing this a lot, then I would probably recommend using a proper development environment. Nonetheless, we're going to click on in portal and then continue. And then, as I said before, we can create different types of Azure functions. So the webhook and API, triggered event functions, timer, or there are other templates that you can pick from. Again, we're going to select timer. and click create. And in short, that basically creates our timer triggered function for us named timer trigger 1, and it puts in some default code into this file called run CSX. Now if you go over here, you can actually have a look at the files that make up the Azure function. So we have our main code file, which is run CSX, and then we have function.json, which has some configuration in it, and we'll come back to that when we start talking about configuring our timer schedule. You can actually see something here that alludes to that. But for now, let's jump back to run CSX, and we'll start to write our first function to call the Slack webhook. So the first thing we want to do is add another using statement to system text, because we will be making use of that later. And then we want this main run method to run asynchronously. And so we just put in the async keyword as so. And we also, therefore, need to pass back a task. So public static async task run. I'm not going to go into the asynchronous programming model within C#, but basically it makes use of the async and await keywords, and we will make use of it through the rest of this code. Now actually, just to take you through what we are going to do, we're going to create two more method functions, both of which are asynchronous. One is going to make a call to Slack with a message, and the other one is going to make a call to Stack Overflow and get a list of questions. So we're actually going to go backwards, and we're going to test our very similar endpoint names. We're going to test, and I'll make sure I get it correct, our Slack endpoint first, the one we've just set up, to make sure that we can trigger it from within our Azure function. So in order to do that, we're going to create a new asynchronous method. And we'll call it public static async, passing back a task, and this time we're actually going to give it, we're expecting a string to come back this time, and we just call it anything we like. So we'll call it make stack request, and we're going to expect to pass in a string. Now one thing it does do, by the looks of it, is it will actually color code the object instances here, and if you made a mistake, it will, sting. It doesn't recognize that. So that is something. So you should be able to see whether you've made any mistakes using that, if nothing else. So this is our first synchronous method. We're going to make a request to the Stack endpoint, and the first thing we really need to do is make use of a HTTP client object, and we're going to use that to make our requests to our endpoint. So we're going to put that within a using statement. We're going to create our client, our HTTP client, of type var initially, and then that's just a new HTTP client. And again, you've got to be really careful with the case sensitivity and all that kind of stuff, otherwise you'll end up with some difficult errors to debug. But nonetheless, you will actually, when you can save and compile it, you will actually get some output in the console down here, so you can generally find out what mistakes you've made. And the reason we're putting this within a using statement, it just means it will be automatically disposed when we no longer need it, and it'll be cleaned up. Cool. So the first thing we want to do within this method is create the string data that we want to attach to our HTTP client object when we make the request. So create another variable, we'll call it request data. And we're going to use something called string content to create this string. So first thing we want to pass in is actually our JSON payload. Now, if you remember when we tested it within the web client we used just before, the JSON string is open curly bracket, single quote this time, text, close single quote, colon, and then what we're going to do is we're actually going to just pass in the message here as part of as the actual payload that we want to use. okay. And then we will just, we need to make sure that we actually enclose it in quotes as well. So this is where it gets a little bit, you have to be quite careful how you type this in, and then we just want to close off with a following single quote and a curly bracket. There we go. So that's basically our messaging string completed. And then we have to add a couple of other things in here just to make sure that we're specifying the right encoding and data type. So in here, you just do encoding UTF-8, and then the data type, which in this case is application JSON. And that should be it. So again, if we get errors, we will come back to this, but let me just check over. So we're creating our string message, which is basically this stuff here. We're passing in the key of text in single quotes, and then we're appending our actual message within another pair of, the value effectively within another pair of single quotes. So the next thing we then want to do is actually make a call to our Slack endpoint. And we're going to do that by creating a response object, which is basically made, populated as the result of making a call to our post async method on our client. So again, we're using the asynchronous programming model within .NET, so you need these sync await pair keywords in order for all that to work. And basically await keyword is basically just saying we're going to make a request and we're going to come back to this when we eventually get a response. So we're going to make use of our HTTP client object here, and then we're going to call the post async method on that. Now if you're making a GET request, you'd call GET async, etc, etc. Now all we need to really pass into this here is this this string here, which is our, should be familiar to you as our Slack webhook. Now I'm going to prepend the string with a $, which basically means this is a kind of literal string and we don't get any errors based around delimited characters that will cause the string to error out. But in fact, if I take that out, actually it won't show you because we're not running it in Visual Studio Code, but just take my word for it, but you need to put this $, in ahead of the string, so it just takes it as a literal string. And then the only other thing we need to pass in is this request data here that we've already created. So this is just basically telling this object the data type and the payload that it's going to expect as part of the post request. So it's quite straightforward actually. So then the last thing we want to do is just pass back the string result that we get back from that call. And again, we use the await keyword on our response, because we're going to read any string data that we get back, any content we get back from it, and we're just going to read as string async. And that's just reading the contents of this, any content in this response object here. And then we simply pass back the result. And then the only thing left to do really is actually make a call to this method from within our main run method. And we'll do that up here. So await, and we'll just copy this. And we'll pass in a test message. Now we will eventually, when we make our do our second function and make our call to Stack Overflow, we will then actually rework this message. But for now, we're just going to do something like hello from Azure. Now you can also see that we're not actually really doing anything with this string result. I've just put this pattern in just because, in case we do want to use it subsequently, but really all we're interested in is making a call to our Stack, to our Slack endpoint. So let's save that, and this is when we will find out if we have any errors down here. Looks okay, I think. And that's in the log, sorry, not in the console. Looks okay, yep, so yep, I think that looks like it's okay. So all we need to do now, I can minimize this, I can't seem to do that, click on that, is if we bring back up our, here is our Slack application. Let's get rid of that. And let's see if we can minimize this. Cool, now let's run it. And this is, we're not operating off our timer function or anything like that at the moment. We're just going to run it manually. And if everything works correctly, then we should see, and there we go. Actually, I didn't notice that. I think when we saved it, it obviously ran it. So if we click it, let's just change that. And we'll do save and run. There we go, so that is working. So that's great. So basically what we've done is we have wired up our first asynchronous method that uses a HTTP client object. We've constructed some string content, which basically tells the client about the payload it needs to send, and we've made a call to our webhook with a static message. So that's good, that's all wired up. So what we need to do next is move on to the next function, which is making a call to Stack Overflow in order to then send a proper message back to our Slack endpoint. Okay, so before we move on with coding up our second method, I'm just going to take you over to the Stack Overflow API. So if you just type in Stack Overflow API to Google, you will get this. The first link should be documentation to Stack Exchange API. Stack Exchange is just the kind of parent organization of Stack Overflow. I believe they run a number of different websites. Stack Overflow, I think, is probably their most famous one. For those of you who have not used Stack Overflow, it's basically, I can't believe if you're watching this you haven't used it, but if you haven't used it, it's basically a question and answer platform for developers. So I personally would have been very stuck without it. Generally, if you come up against a problem, it will usually have a good answer for you. And they very usefully provide you with an API that allows you to hook in and just query that database via APIs, which is awesome, and that's what we're going to make use of here. You can see here, as I'm scrolling down, there are lots of different methods you can call, but we are just going to make use of the search API here. And it gives you a bit of background about what it is and how you use it, and you can even try it down at the bottom of the page. So it's entirely up to you what you want to search for. I'm just going to use the in title search criteria. You can put anything you like in here. Let's try something like RCS, which I'm quite interested in, and we'll run it. And you can see here, sorry, before I run it, you can see the URL that's generated for you, which is really nice. We'll click run, and it will return back a JSON payload with all the relevant questions that have RCS in the title. Okay, so let's take this JSON payload and let's just see if we can, let's just copy it into something like JSON Editor Online, and we can take a quick look at the payload and how it's constructed, because that will come in useful later when we come to parsing it. Now, I would have thought that you could have copied this payload somehow without having to do it the way I'm doing it here, which is rather painful, but nonetheless, I've done it now. Copy, and we'll just use something like JSON Editor Online, which is my preferred JSON editor. There we go. So just get rid of the default JSON and paste that in, and make sure it's well formatted, and then we just push it over to this next window, which I really like here. So you can see here that we had an array of 30 items, got it, returned back. So each one of these represents a question that has RCS somewhere in the title. So there we go, RCS generates bad prediction, blah, 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 so that's cool. So the idea will be that we will make a call to this API and we'll say, I want you to give me all the questions that have been asked in the last 24 hours with RCS in the title. So the call we have just made there, the test call we've just made there, is only put the search criteria of RCS in the title, what you would need to do in order to just get a result set for the last 24 hours is make use of this from date here, and it quite usefully gives you a calendar drop down with the ability to select a date. However, it does get a little bit more complex than that when you actually come to using it from a programmatic point of view. So let's select the 3rd of November. We'll rerun it, and you can see there are no questions that have been asked within that time period. That's all okay. But what you will notice, it has, again, very usefully formatted the API string that we would need to call, and you can see here that this attribute here, from date, has, goodness, it keeps going to another page. What you can see is the from date is this rather strange string here that looks nothing like a date or time string. Now, what that actually is, if you go back up here to the documentation, it does tell you about the date format that they have decided to use, and it's something called Unix epoch time, and it's the time in seconds from when Linux was released or something like that. Seems to be taking a while. There we go. Yeah, there we go. All dates in the API are in Unix epoch time, which is the number of seconds since midnight UTC January the 1st, 1970, which is a bit weird, but okay, fine. That's what they've decided to use. So when we come to writing a function, we're just going to have to bear that in mind, that when we make the call, we're going to have to convert to that particular time format and make the call. Now, in this instance, when we have, if we move back to our API, when we made the test call, we put in, not the last 24 hours, but the last few days, and it came back with nothing. So we probably want to play around with that just for the purposes of testing our API. So I think from memory, if we put it back to something like the 1st of July, we should get a result. No, we don't. Let me move, it must be a bit further back. Let's try April. There we go. So we get, looks like one result back there. Let's just copy that out and just test. It looks like we did only get one result, which is probably a good one to start with. So we might just paste that in, move it over. Yeah, we only have one question returned back with that created date. So we might, to begin with, just hard code that string into our the next method call that we're going to write. So let's get on and do that now. Okay, so we're going to now write our Stack Overflow request, and just looking at the code we've already written, or I've already written, I incorrectly named our original method call Stack request, when really it should be Slack request. Otherwise it's going to get very, very confusing. So we'll just first off rename our original function, which is making our request to Slack, as Slack request. And now we're going to come on and write our function to create our Stack Overflow request. Now, it's actually very similar to this, so where there's identical code, I am just going to cut and paste to save me from typing it, and more importantly, to save you from watching me type it. But anything new, of course, I'll type it in step by step. So the first thing we want to do in order to prepare for our new function, we are going to use JSON. So when you, as you've seen already, when you get the reply back from Stack Overflow, you get a JSON payload. So we need to deserialize that into an object, and we need to use the JSON soft library to do that. Now, that's not included by default when you create an Azure function, so we need to include that library in. Now, the way you do that in Azure Functions is #r, double brackets, and then the name of the library, which in this case is newtonsoft.json. And again, just be really careful with the capitalization there. If you get it wrong, you might end up with some errors. There is no semicolon at the end of that. Now, if you've done any .NET Core programming, it's very similar to putting a reference in your CS proj file, same sort of thing. We're basically just telling the code to include this library or require it. And then, of course, we need to make a reference to it here as well. If you get the name correct, newtonsoft .json, and that does of course require a semicolon. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy this. I think that is identical. I'm just going to paste that in. Cool. Now we do actually need one other using directive in here using system.net, which I'll come on to why we need that in a minute. Other than that, that's all the using statements I believe we require. I think that looks correct. Cool. So let's come on to writing our Stack Exchange request. So I'm going to copy from here our previous request. And in this instance, this method's not going to take anything. You can change that, of course, if you want to maybe pass in your search criteria. I'm just going to hard code it in this video. And I'm going to change the name of this obviously to stack, and I'm going to put overflow in here as well. Otherwise it would get quite confusing between stack and slack. So this is make stack overflow request, and I'll just close out these curly brackets, and then again we're going to create a HTTP client to make that request. All good. Now, one thing before we actually do that, and one thing that's, I don't know if I've seen it anywhere else, but certainly on the Stack Overflow site, if I just bring it back over, well actually you don't even really need to see it. Yes, as you know, it will bring back a JSON payload. However, when you call that API programmatically, it actually returns back the JSON as a compressed payload, zipped payload effectively, so you can't work with it natively. What you actually have to do is decompress it before you can work with it. Now that caught me out when I started using this API. So we need to make some provision for that, and it's relatively straightforward, and that's why we needed to include this system.net using directive, because we make use of a class in that namespace. So in our make Stack Overflow request, we're going to do a bit of work in here, and we're going to use this HTTP client handler object. We'll call it something like handler, and spell it right, and it's just a new HTTP handler. Now I'm copying this because, again, if I make a typo, I want it to be in the same place throughout rather than just in one place, because it will be harder to track. We're going to create that object now. Just make sure you put a semicolon in there, otherwise you'll get, of course, an error. And then we're going to set this automatic decompression equal to decompression methods, and then this is where you select the method of decompression that you want, and in the first instance we want to try and use gzip to unzip it, otherwise we'll use deflate. So if I just copy this again, because it's quite a so basically we are creating our handler object, and we're saying that we want to set automatic decompression, first of all to gzip, otherwise to deflate. And what we then do is we actually pass this object into our HTTP client object when we create it. So it's basically saying, okay, client, if you receive a payload, automatically decompress it if required. Cool. So let's just save that. And we'll check the logs. Now, there we go. We're getting an error. It's saying make Stack Overflow request, not all code paths return a value. That's okay. We've not got to that bit yet because we are expecting a string to be returned, and we're not yet returning a string, so that's okay. Otherwise, it looks okay. We're not getting any other complaints, which is good. So the next thing we want to do is make a request. A GET request using our client. We don't need to create any request data because it's a GET request we're going to call, so we don't need to provide any data like we did with the POST request. So I'm just going to copy this bit of code here. It's not new. The only thing that is new is instead of POST async, we are going to call GET async. And in exactly the same way, we're just going to paste in our string into that. So let's go back over to where we were playing with, here we are, Stack Exchange. I'm just going to click on that, and that will give us the full URL here that we need to use. So we'll just copy that and go back over to Azure and paste that in. Now, what you may, again, want to provide dynamically is this search parameter here, and you may want to provide it in through your method signature. That's cool. I'm not going to do that here. It's fairly trivial to do, but what we will need to do is dynamically provide this Unix epoch value, but we'll come on to that in a bit. We'll leave it hard-coded for now, and we'll rectify that in a bit. Cool. And then finally, it's actually going to be identical to this stuff here, so I'm just going to copy it. I'm just quickly go through what it does again. So this is going to make a get, an asynchronous get request to Stack Exchange. It should get the payload back if there is anything, decompress it, and then put it into this result, which we pass back. And we're using this read async string method to do that. So let's save that again, and we'll just quickly look at the logs. And this time we get a compilation succeeded, so we're returning a string back, so we're getting rid of that original error that we had. Okay, so that should be okay. Now, the only thing we then need to do is actually make a call to our new function. In order to do that, we will create a JSON object result that we're going to pass the result into from our new method. And because it's an asynchronous method, we should use the await keyword. Okay, now let's save that. Check out our logs. Now, one of the things I will just point out, we got a second compilation succeeded is great. What I have noticed over time when you save it and check the logs, I don't know if I'm doing something wrong, but the logs stop updating and you no longer get these messages. So what I do in that instance is I just make sure I save my work, I come out of Azure, close the browser, go back into it, and it works again. I'm not sure why that happens. I think it's a bit of a bug anyway. So what we want to do, let's just change this and go hello from Azure with call to Stack Overflow. And we'll just make sure that, even though it's compiling, we'll just make sure that everything is still working the way we expect it to. So here we've got loads of messages, hello from Azure again. Let me just save and run that and bring that back up, and hopefully if we do, we get our new message coming through. So everything is still working as we expect, which is good. So we've only really got a couple of things left to do now. The first thing we want to do is we want to count the number of questions, new questions that we get back in our payload. And in order to do that, we need to deserialize the JSON string that we get returned back. And then the final thing we need to do is dynamically create that UTC time string so that when the function runs every hour or every day, that will be dynamically generated. And actually the final thing we need to do is update our schedule, which will set this function to run every day as opposed to I think it's running by default every 5 minutes. That's why we had loads of messages splaying up our stack screen, and we want to obviously change that and set that to a less frequent time period. So again, back over in our code window, what we want to do is deserialize our JSON string. Now that's quite straightforward using the JSON.NET library. Cool. So actually I'm just going to rename this to, let's name it to result actually, because I want to reuse that other name for what we're going to do now. So yeah, again, we're getting our JSON result. Actually, let's call it something like JSON string. That's better. Okay, so we're getting our JSON string back and we want to convert it to a JSON object. That makes more sense. So we're going to create a new object, JSON object. And then this is where we make use of our Newtonsoft library, and there is a class in there called JSON convert. And then we call deserialize object. using the American Z instead of the correct S. And we then, and I've done videos on this previously, so if you're interested, look at my JSON, deserializing JSON video. In here, you can actually pass a class name of a JSON object that you want to deserialize to. I'm not going to do that, so simply we just provide the dynamic keywords, so the deserializer figures out what the object should look like based on the payload, so it's really powerful. Comes with a couple of downsides, but nonetheless that's what we're going to use. And then what we're going to pass in, we're going to pass in this JSON string here. So just to recap, we're going to create a proper JSON object which will allow us to count the number of items that we get back, and in order to do that we use the deserialize method on this JSON convert object, and we are letting that deserializer dynamically decide what the object should be. Let's just save that because I just want to make sure I've not made any errors. Looks okay. Now this might be an instance where this has stopped working. Maybe not, but let's give it the benefit of the doubt for the moment. Looks okay. We can come back and fix up if I have made a mistake. And we're then going to create another object. Don't really need to do this, but just doing it step by step, it probably makes it a bit simpler. We're going to just create an object called question count. Let's say something new, question count. And then what we're going to basically do is make use of our JSON object. And let's go back here, actually, to our JSON payload. And I just want to make this really clear to you. We get this object back, and it then has this items key, which then contains our array of questions, okay? So we actually have to reference, if you look at it here, we actually have to reference this before we can start to count the items inside it. So the way we do that is very simple. We just type in items here. Now, this is where this use of the dynamic keyword can be a little bit problematic, because this use of the word items isn't determined until runtime or compilation time. So if you've made an error, it can cause some problems, but I'm hoping that we should be okay. And then we simply just count the number of items, number of objects within that items array. If you go back here, items is actually an array, and that's denoted by this opening square bracket. Again, watch my video on JSON if that doesn't really make a lot of sense to you. So what would be nice is if we actually write out this count to our Stack Overflow, not our Stack Overflow, our Slack channel. So we go, you have, and then we can actually, if you do this string literal, and then we just, rather than using that horrible plus sign appendation stuff that I've done before, you can just insert the new question count in here. You have questions on Stack Overflow. So let's see if that works. Let's save it first. And let's just move this over here, and let's bring up our, this is getting a bit messy now. Let's see if we can run it and get that message. So we're not getting the message. So there's something wrong somewhere along the line. So we're not getting anything in here. So what I'm going to do, as I've said, make sure I save this. And I'm going to kill my browser, and I'm going to go back in. I'll go to portal on Azure. And we'll go back to all resources and make sure I pick the right one, because I've got, as you can see here, I've got a few that have very similar names. And we'll look at our function again, make sure it is the right one. Is that the right one? It is the right one. So let's look at our logs and let's save that. Actually, there's been no change, so maybe we just make a quick change somewhere. On Stack Overflow, exclamation mark. So let's save that. Okay, so we're getting this JSON convert does not contain a definition for deserialize object. So I've clearly made a typographical error there. Let me just check what I've done wrong. Okay, so I just typo, so deserialize object. I think that's the only thing that was wrong. Let's bring our logs back up. Let's save that again. Okay, we got compilation succeeded. Cool, so our compilation has succeeded. No guarantee that it's going to run. Let's just try that again then. And with any luck, if we run it, and I think we're getting another error down here, so let's have a look at what that is. Newtonsoft JSON link G container count cannot be used like a method. So maybe we don't have curly brackets here. Maybe that's all it is. Let's save it. And let's run it again. There we go. My bad. So no curly brackets on the count method. And then we can see that we have one question on Stack Overflow. So that's all working quite nicely. Now, I deliberately showed you the fact that I'd made a mistake and what I did to rectify that mistake. I could have quite easily edited that out and you'd have been none the wiser. I wanted to show you that I made a typo. We do. And that's one of the downsides of using this environment, because it's not as obvious when you use something like Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code. So one of the problems with it, and I wanted to show that limitation, also a limitation of my poor typing skills, but also how you can then rectify it by looking at the logs, and if the logs stop working, how you rectify that. So I just wanted to provide some real life examples of problems you may encounter as a developer. So the second to last thing we need to do is deal with this weird Unix time string. At the moment, we've just got a hard-coded value in there. We want to set that dynamically so that we just pull back questions within the last 24 hours rather than having something hard-coded. So let's clear that down, give ourselves a bit more room. Now, where should we put it? I think we just probably put it within the make Stack Overflow request method. Probably makes the most sense, and we'll just create it up here, I guess. That's probably the place I would put it. Okay, so we're going to create effectively that's not really a string, it's a number of seconds that we want to inject into here. So let's create a new var and we'll call it, I don't know, epoch time. Good enough name as anything. Now, let me just type out the string and then I'll go through it and explain it afterwards, because trying to explain it as I go, I think, is probably going to be a bit more complex than explaining it once it's fully there. Okay, so I just put a bit of music over there because it was a bit laborious to watch me doing it. So basically what we're using the date time now object. We're getting the universal time now, so as of this moment, but we want to get questions within the last 24 hours. So in order to update that, we then use this add days operator, and we add negative days to it. So you can go forward in the future. Obviously you'll get 0 results, I would assume, or you can add negative numbers to subtract days from where we are now. So you can update this if you want questions from within the last 24 hours, then it would be a 1, 48 hours it would be a 2, and you can play around with that. And then what we want to do is effectively subtract from now this Unix epoch time, which is the 1st of January 1970, and then we want to get the total seconds of that subtraction, and that gives us our time span for now. It's a bit convoluted. On the last thing we want to do is convert it to a 32-bit integer. That's just, I believe, the standard that we need to use, and we put it into this value here. So then, to make use of that, we go back down to our string, and we will just delete the hard-coded value, put in some curly brackets, and copy and paste that in. So that should now dynamically update moving forward. So let's save that. Hopefully there are no, it does say compilation succeeded, okay. So I fully expect now when we run this, we should have 0 questions, because we're basically just going back the last 24 hours, and from memory there are no questions. So let's run this. There we go, we get 0 questions on Stack Overflow, that's good. Now just to maybe test that it is working, let's update this to 300, let's do it for the last year, 365 days. Let's move this over here again, and let's save and run it. And there, we have 5 new questions on Stack Overflow related to RCS, which is all looking good. So I'm going to put that back to 1, and we'll save and run it again, and that will continue to run. Now the last thing we need to do is update our scheduler, because at the moment this thing is running every 5 minutes when I'm not running it manually as well. So that is all done within this function.json file. And you can see we have a JSON key value pair set up as usual, and there is this schedule element, and we want to update that now to just run every day. So to do that, this expression here is something called a cron tab expression, or an n cron tab expression. So just as an FYI, I'll actually bring it over here. So again, this is my blog, and I actually have an article, step-by-step article on how to run or how to create this. Well, it's not exactly the same, and I'll come on to why in a minute, this same function, but it does have details on the scheduling stuff, and I have put a link into this, more detailed information about how you can configure this scheduling operation. Again, it's a Unix type setup, so interestingly, we're using a Unix time string, and we're also using a Unix cron scheduling expression to run our scheduler. I'm not going to go into too much detail about that, but each of these little stars represents like a day, a month, blah, blah, blah. So at the moment, this is running every 5 minutes. I want to change that to a more standard date and time. So rather than every 5 minutes, I'm going to run it at 9:30 every day. So that's 9:30 a.m. every day. Okay, that's the seconds component, and that's the day, month, year, I guess, moving forward. So if you want to read up more on that, you can do it, but I'm just going to quickly move on and say I want to run that at 9:30 every day, and that's basically how you do it, and it will just run every 24 hours. So save and run that, shouldn't make any difference, it's just the configuration file, and it will just more than likely get another, we get another little thing pop up on here. Now, just before we finish, I'll just circle back to the original solution that I had come up with for this, if you are interested. Looked a bit like this. So where it's different, you'll notice the inclusion of a SQL database. So the way I'd originally designed this was the Azure function would run, it would go to Stack Exchange, get a list of every single question on your selected topic, so no time string or anything like that. It would bring all those questions back, store them in the SQL database. Then the next day when it ran, it would go again, pull everything back and compare what it had in the database from yesterday compared to the new payload, and then determine the new questions that had arrived. Hugely, hugely inefficient, really horrible, almost embarrassing that I wrote that. And I think the solution I've gone through in this video is much nicer, but the article on online on the blog details the old solution where you use a database and it uses that method. Now I've left it there because if nothing else, it actually is useful from the perspective of telling you how you can integrate or introduce a database into your Azure Functions, which may be a really useful thing that you want to do. So I've left that in there, and from that perspective it's useful, but the solution itself is really horrible from a logical perspective. Well, once again we come to the end of yet another video, and once again I'll thank you for watching and supporting the channel. I really do appreciate it. If you want to get notified of any new videos that I post up, subscribe to the channel, click the little dingy bell and you'll get emailed notifications when I do that. And if you like this video, give it a like. But do you know what? If you don't want to do that, I'm totally okay with that. So until I make the next video, I'll see you again next time.